It was late in the afternoon when Lin first felt the surge of energy course through his body. The bright fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting long shadows over the lab's sleek, white surfaces. The equipment blinked and beeped in its usual rhythm as Lin carefully adjusted the electrodes on the edge of the electrofield manipulator, the latest and most ambitious project he'd been working on at the Power Engineering Lab. His lab coat was wrinkled, and the sleeves were pushed up to reveal a few tattoos he'd never mentioned to anyone, mostly abstract designs from his university days, just rebellious enough to stand out in a sea of white-collar engineers. He was late, of course. That was a given. Late to the presentation, late to set things up. Always late to the important moments. But when the pulse of electric power hummed in the air, Lin felt like he might finally be on the verge of something extraordinary. Or, as his colleagues in the lab would say, a really bad idea. Ready? Dr. Wang's voice cracked through his focus, sending a ripple through the bubble of concentrated silence he had created. She stood at the back of the room, her eyes narrowed in a mix of curiosity and suspicion, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Lin didn't bother looking up. He was fine, more than fine. I've got it under control, don't worry. The device, a massive array of interconnected wires and nodes, sat at the center of the lab like some sort of technological beast ready to pounce. At its heart was a pulsating core, a power generator capable of manipulating electrical currents on an atomic scale. Lin had spent weeks tweaking it, and now, with everyone else watching and no turning back, he finally pushed the button. The room shuddered. A crackling energy rose from the machine, seizing the air, sending electric arcs flashing across the metallic walls. Lin grinned like a mad scientist, exhilarated by the sight of the power humming in the lab, like the pulse of the city itself. Then something went terribly wrong. For a fraction of a second, the air itself seemed to split open. It wasn't just the lights flickering, the entire room seemed to bend and warp with energy, as if the laws of physics had temporarily surrendered. Lin froze, his hand still hovering above the control panel, his heart pounding in his chest. But before anyone could react, a surge of electricity exploded from the machine, sending a massive shockwave across the lab. Everything happened so fast that Lin's body was flung backward. His head slammed into the floor with a sickening thud, and a wave of heat and static filled the air. The last thing he heard before everything went black was the scream of Dr. Wang, but it sounded distorted, like someone was speaking through a thick glass. When Lin opened his eyes, he found himself lying on a hospital bed. His head throbbed, and his body felt strange, as though something was off. He blinked a few times, trying to clear the fog in his mind, but the confusion didn't dissipate. A nurse stood nearby, watching him with a faint, almost clinical interest. "You're awake," she said, her voice flat. "What happened?" Lin croaked, his throat dry. He tried to sit up, but the nurse gently pushed him back down. "Don't move just yet," she said. "There was an accident at the lab. Some kind of electrical overload. The doctors will be in shortly to check on you." The nurse stepped out, leaving Lin alone in the sterile, white room. His fingers itched with the need to move, to feel something, anything, but for a moment, all he could do was stare at the ceiling. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in a rhythmic pattern, but it felt different. He could almost sense the way the electricity pulsed, felt the flow of power through the very air. Wait a minute, something was wrong. Lin sat up more carefully this time, his mind racing. A strange energy seemed to ripple through the space, like he could sense every single current that ran through the room. The hospital machines that beeped in the corners, the lights overhead, the electrical currents running through the walls, it was like he could feel them all. It was as if his body had become attuned to the electromagnetic field in a way that was both overwhelming and somehow natural. What was happening to him? The door creaked open, and Dr. Wang stepped in, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. She was followed by a pair of medical staff, who quickly began running through their checks. "Lin," Dr. Wang said, lowering her voice as the nurse checked his vitals, "how do you feel? The doctors have been running tests, and your body's been exposed to an unprecedented amount of electrical energy. You shouldn't have survived. Lin looked at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Funny, I don't feel so bad. In fact, I feel great. Dr. Wang's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in something that bordered on fascination. How so? I don't know how to explain it. But I can feel everything. I can feel the electricity. Like it's part of me. I can hear it, too. All the machines, the lights, even the flow of data, it's like I'm inside the system. For a moment, there was silence. The medical staff continued their work, but Dr. Wang looked more intrigued than concerned. Lin closed his eyes, focusing harder. His senses were sharper now, more attuned to the electronic pulses that flowed through the world around him. He could almost feel the information, the way it moved from one device to another, the silent conversations that took place in the data streams. It was all there, within reach. You've gained something, Lin, Dr. Wang said slowly, her tone shifting. Something beyond what we imagined. This could change everything. Over the next few days, Lin tried to make sense of what had happened to him. At first, he thought it might just be some lingering side effect of the electrical surge. But as time went on, he realized it was more than that. The power wasn't just inside him, it was around him. Everywhere. He could hear the hum of electrical currents running through the power lines outside the window, feel the electromagnetic waves that pulsed through the air like an invisible tide. He could trace the paths of the information flowing between devices, like reading an invisible map that told the story of every conversation, every transaction, every secret buried in the digital world. It was intoxicating. At first, Lin didn't know what to do with this newfound ability. He tested it cautiously. He manipulated the hospital's electronic systems, just small things, adjusting the lighting, overriding the security systems to unlock doors, nudging the temperature controls. But as he grew more comfortable with his powers, he began to realize just how vast his reach was. He could hack into any system, any device, with nothing more than a thought. The encrypted data that had once been beyond his grasp was now wide open to him. He could feel the flow of information between servers, deciphering hidden messages, revealing secrets that were meant to stay buried. The thrill of discovery consumed him. He began using his abilities more recklessly, tapping into corporate servers, listening in on private conversations, and even cracking into encrypted government files. The secrets he uncovered were enough to make his head spin. A whisper of corruption in the highest echelons of power here, a series of financial scandals there. Lin had become more than just a man, he had become a part of the digital world itself. But there was a cost. The more he manipulated the flow of information, the more he realized that he could influence not just data, but people. It started subtly, nudging a few decisions, altering a few minor outcomes. He could make someone choose to buy a product, or shift the direction of a conversation without them ever realizing it, but it didn't stop there. As his abilities grew stronger, Lin found that he could alter the very choices people made. A simple push in the right direction, a slight change in the flow of information, and people would do things they never would have otherwise. They would choose paths they never would have walked. He could make them believe things, see things, choose things, all without them even knowing, and that's when the true temptation set in. Lin's mind raced with the possibilities. The power to influence others, to control the flow of information, it was an overwhelming temptation. He could do anything. He could fix the broken systems in society. He could expose corruption, rewrite history, even change the course of people's lives. He could make the world a better place, couldn't he? But at what cost? As he sat alone in his apartment, the city's skyline stretching out before him in a sprawling sea of lights, Lin realized just how far he had already gone. The things he could do now felt like magic. He wasn't just manipulating electricity, he was manipulating reality itself. With a simple thought, he could break into any database, access personal information, change an email, or even influence what someone would think or feel in a given moment. The world was his to command, and it was all too easy. But somewhere deep down, something nagged at him. Was he becoming too powerful? Was it right to use this ability on others, even if it was for a greater good? After all, who was he to decide the fate of someone else's life, or to manipulate the choices that people made? He had started small, changing the temperature on his neighbor's thermostat for a laugh, slipping into a bank's computer system to change a few numbers, but as the days went on, he found himself pushing the boundaries further. It had started innocently. The thrill of cracking a password, the rush of seeing hidden data, was enough to keep him hooked. But soon, it was no longer about curiosity. It became about control. The first time he'd altered someone's decision without them knowing, just a nudge, a slight shift in the way they saw the world, was when the real power of his gift began to reveal itself. It was small at first, a harmless thing, like changing a yes to a no, or the other way around. A friend who'd been debating whether or not to buy an expensive gadget suddenly found themselves with a new purchase in their cart, their mind convinced it was the right decision. The experiment was fascinating, but the more he used it, the more he realized the vastness of his influence. It wasn't just about controlling a device or intercepting data, it was about reshaping the choices of every person around him. He had become a puppeteer, and the world his stage, but the consequences of his actions weren't always clear at first. He found it easy to justify, after all, he wasn't doing anything harmful, right? It was just a little nudge here and there, a few strategic manipulations to make life more convenient, or perhaps to expose a lie or a scam. And when he did change someone's decision, it felt like he was making a difference in the world. People didn't know they were being influenced, but Lin could see the subtle shifts in their behavior. The decision they had made was altered, yes, but did that make it wrong? Yet, as he continued, Lin started to notice something troubling. The more he changed, the less he could trust what was real. His perception of the world became warped, as if he was seeing the world through an electric lens, a digital filter. The choices of the people around him weren't theirs anymore, they were his. He started to wonder if anyone had made a decision on their own in the last few days, or if all their actions had been steered by him in some way. One evening, Lin sat on his bed, scrolling through the endless stream of data he had access to. The information was intoxicating. He could see the email exchanges, the financial transactions, the secret phone calls. He could hear the hum of thoughts vibrating in the circuits of the city's systems. He could feel the weight of the world's knowledge at his fingertips. But then something stopped him. It wasn't a sound or a thought or even the data itself. It was a feeling, an ache. He hadn't felt it before. It was the sense that, with all his power, he had lost touch with something real. He turned off his laptop, his hand lingering on the shutdown button. For a moment, the room was still. He listened to the hum of the electronics around him, the subtle current that flowed through every wire, every connection, every device. There it was again, the strange, unsettling sense that something was wrong. The world felt hollow, like it was just an illusion, a string of interconnected nodes waiting to be manipulated. The next day, Lin found himself unable to shake the feeling. His usual routines had lost their spark. The things that had once excited him, hacking into a corporate database, uncovering a financial scandal, listening in on a private conversation, now seemed trivial. He had seen too much. He had taken too much control. His ability had become more of a burden than a gift. He began to question everything he'd done. Could he even trust his own choices anymore? Were his actions truly his own, or were they just the product of his new ability, warped by the need to be in control? He felt the pull of his power, the magnetic urge to manipulate once more, but something inside him hesitated. What was the point of knowing everything if you couldn't trust yourself anymore? What was the point of controlling everything if it meant losing touch with reality? And then, in a quiet moment, Lin realized the truth. He had become a part of the very system he had once sought to understand. He was no longer just observing the currents of the world around him, he was a part of them. The information he had once accessed with curiosity now felt like an invasive force, cutting through the lives of those around him. He could change everything, yes, but at what cost? The next time he hacked into a system, he found himself hesitating. Instead of pulling the strings as he had before, he just watched. He let the system run its course, no interference. He let the data flow, untouched, unaltered. And for the first time in weeks, Lin felt something akin to peace, but that peace didn't last. Lin's phone buzzed on the table beside him, breaking the silence. It was a message from an anonymous source, just a string of numbers and letters that seemed to make no sense. At first, Lin was annoyed. Another hacker trying to play a game? But as his fingers hovered over the screen, something made him pause. The numbers seemed familiar. He'd seen them before, hidden within a stream of encrypted data. But these numbers, this particular sequence, they were different. He could feel it. They were directed at him. He opened the message, "I see you." It was brief, but it hit him like a shock. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding in his chest. The message wasn't a coincidence. Someone was aware of him. Someone had noticed the changes he'd made, the way he'd manipulated the world around him. Lin sat back in his chair, his mind racing. There was no going back. He had crossed a line. Someone knew. He wasn't alone in the digital world anymore. The next few days passed in a blur. Lin couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. The message had rattled him in a way he hadn't expected. He couldn't shake the nagging thought that someone else, someone more powerful, was out there, someone who could do what he did, but better, faster, and with fewer reservations. It wasn't just the message that haunted him. It was the sense that he had let his abilities run wild, that he had pushed the boundaries too far. He didn't know who had sent that message, but he knew one thing for sure. It was a warning. He had always thought he could control everything, but now he wasn't so sure. The systems he had once seen as his domain now felt like a prison, a web of invisible threads that bound him as much as they freed him. That night, as Lin sat staring at the flickering screen of his laptop, a realization struck him. He wasn't just manipulating information. He wasn't just changing the world around him. He had become part of it, connected in ways he didn't fully understand, and that scared him more than anything else. The digital world was vast, and there were forces out there that he had yet to comprehend. And as the realization settled in, Lin faced the truth. He couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't continue living in a world of constant manipulation, of bending reality to his will. So he made a choice. He was going to walk away. He closed his laptop with a finality that felt both terrifying and liberating. He turned off his phone, silencing the constant barrage of messages and notifications. For the first time in weeks, Lin felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't freedom. He couldn't have freedom in a world so interconnected, so tightly woven with data, but it was peace. He would live without it. As the city's lights flickered outside his window, Lin sat in silence, finally at peace with the knowledge that he no longer needed to control everything. He didn't need to know the future, to see the hidden truths. He was content in his ignorance, but somewhere, deep in the back of his mind, a whisper lingered. He could always see the truth again. Just one more time. Lin couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking away from something monumental. Every step he took away from the digital world felt like a disconnection, a severing of ties with the very essence of who he had become. The withdrawal wasn't as simple as turning off his laptop or silencing his phone. It was a conscious uncoupling from the grip of something that had taken root deep within him. The digital world had become a part of his psyche, his consciousness. To pull away from it now was like asking a man to walk away from his own skin. He sat still in his apartment, staring at the wall in front of him. The hum of the city outside, the flashing lights from the streets below, felt distant, muted, like a soundtrack to a world that was no longer his to control. He missed it, in some ways. The electricity that pulsed through the walls, the constant flow of information, the knowledge that everything was within his reach. It had been exhilarating, yes, but now, in the silence that had settled around him, Lin realized just how much that thrill had cost him. It was the first time in weeks that he had felt his own heartbeat. The simple rhythm of his pulse, the steady thrum of life, seemed so foreign now. It wasn't enough to drown out the noise in his head, though. The noise of knowing, of sensing the electrical currents that flowed everywhere, the subtext of every conversation, the hidden information that threaded through the fabric of society, it was all still there, just out of reach. He had turned it off, but it had left its mark on him. He walked to the window and looked out, the city sprawling below him like a maze of light and shadow. The streets were alive with movement, but it felt like watching a play through a glass. Everyone was just going about their business, unaware of the invisible threads connecting them. He had once been able to see those threads. He could have woven his own path through them, moved people like pawns on a board. But now, all he could do was watch. He stood there for a while, feeling the weight of his decision. Part of him was relieved. He no longer had to bear the burden of knowing everything, of carrying the weight of other people's secrets and desires. But another part of him, the part that had reveled in the power, felt empty. The excitement of bending the world to his will had been intoxicating, and now, without it, the world felt small. How could he ever go back to being just a regular person after all of this? Was he destined to live in ignorance for the rest of his life? The thought made him uneasy. But as the minutes passed, and the city below continued to pulse with life, Lin started to feel the quiet settle inside him, like the calm after a storm. The noise in his head, the constant chatter of the digital world, was fading. He no longer had to listen to it. He didn't need to. And maybe that was enough. But then came the message. It wasn't anything special at first, a simple notification on his phone, the kind of thing he would have ignored in the past. But when Lin saw the name attached to it, his heart skipped a beat. It was from an unknown source, an encrypted message, one that would normally be discarded by his old self. But now, with his curiosity piqued and his nerves on edge, Lin couldn't resist. He opened it. "Still running, are we?" It was short, cryptic. But it was enough to make Lin's blood run cold. The message came with an attachment, a video file. Lin hesitated, his finger hovering over the screen. His instinct told him to ignore it, to let it go, to not allow himself to be dragged back into that world. But something deeper, a gnawing sense of dread mixed with curiosity, urged him to play it. He hit open. The screen flickered for a moment before the video began to play. It was shaky, distorted, like it had been recorded with a poor-quality camera. The first thing Lin saw was his own face. A distorted, blurry version of himself, as though someone had taken a video of him without his knowledge. He could barely recognize himself. The angle was off, the lighting harsh, but there was no mistaking the image. It was him. His heart pounded in his chest. The video shifted, showing a darkened room. Shadows shifted in the corners of the frame, and then, with a sharp jolt, the camera zoomed in on something. A computer screen. A terminal. And on the screen was a series of numbers, ones and zeros scrolling quickly, faster than Lin could process, like someone was typing at an inhuman speed. Then, just as quickly, the video cut to black. The screen flickered for a second longer before the words appeared, "You've been busy. But you're not the only one who can see." Lin's stomach sank. The message wasn't just a warning, it was a challenge. Someone, somehow, had found him. Had found his trail in the digital world. Someone who knew what he could do, who understood the depth of his abilities. And now, they were playing a game of cat and mouse. For the first time in a long while, Lin felt a rush of panic. The calm he had felt moments ago vanished, replaced by an adrenaline-fueled awareness that he was no longer in control. He had walked away, but the world wasn't done with him. He had underestimated the depth of the digital web, and now it was pulling him back in. His thoughts raced, spinning out of control. Who was this? How did they know? More importantly, what did they want? Lin ran his fingers through his hair, the anxiety quickly building. He had been so sure that disconnecting from the world, from the systems he had come to know so intimately, would give him peace. But now, it felt as if he was drowning again. Someone out there had a hold of him, and they were making it clear that he wasn't as free as he had hoped. The power he thought he had shut down was still there, somewhere, waiting to be turned back on. He had thought he could walk away, but this message, this person, was proving that the world he had entered was far deeper and far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. His ability to control the current, to manipulate the flow of information, wasn't just a gift. It was a curse. And now, someone else knew about it. Someone who had their own agenda. He paced the room, his mind racing. There was no way to go back now. He had to face this. He grabbed his phone again and opened the message, hoping to find another clue, another lead. But the screen was blank. No attachment. No words. Just silence. It was as if the world had gone still, waiting for him to make his next move. Lin stared at the blank screen, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The message wasn't just a threat. It was an invitation. Whoever had sent it knew the truth. And now, they wanted him to play. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the familiar rush of electricity pulse through his fingertips, through his veins. It was tempting to reach out again, to use the power he knew he could control, to track down this shadowy figure. But the last time he had done that, he had almost lost himself completely. He didn't want to be that person again, but there was something in his gut that told him he had no choice. The game had changed. And if he didn't play, he might lose everything. He opened his laptop, the familiar hum of the machine filling the quiet room. For a moment, Lin hesitated. But then, with a deep breath, he plunged back into the digital world. The game was on. And this time, he would be ready.